unit rather than dividing them up over much and stretching us beyond what we need to do to give a thorough account of these events. This, of course, is Paul now in Caesarea, the home of the governor. The governor at this time, of course, is Felix. And this is the encounter spearheaded by Tertullus and responded to by Paul, and then a decision is given by Felix. So we're here, and let's read these this section of Scripture together and move through this passage with care and attention. The word of the Lord, Acts chapter 24. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders, with an attorney named Tertullus, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul. After Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying to the governor, "Since we have through you attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are being carried out for this nation, we acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness. But that I may not weary you any further, I beg you to grant us, by your kindness, a brief hearing. For we have found this man a real pest, and a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. And he is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him. We wanted to judge him according to our own law, but Lysias the commander came along and with much violence took him out of our hands, ordering his accusers to come before you. But by examining him yourself concerning all these matters, you will be able to ascertain the things of which we accuse him." The Jews also joined in the attack, asserting that these things were so. And when the governor nodded for him to speak, Paul responded, "Knowing that for many years you have been a judge to this nation, I cheerfully make my defense, since you can take note of the fact that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. Neither in the temple nor in the synagogues, nor in the city itself did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot. Nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. In view of this, I also do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience before God and before men. Now after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings, in which they found me occupied in the temple, having been purified, without any crowd or uproar. But there were some Jews from Asia, who ought to have been present before you and to make accusation if they should have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves tell what misdeed they found when I stood before the council, other than for this one statement which I shouted out while standing among them. For the resurrection of the dead I am on trial before you today." But Felix, having a more exact knowledge about the way, put them off, saying, "When Lysias the commander comes down, I will decide your case." Then he gave orders to the centurion for him to be kept in custody, and yet have some freedom, and not to prevent any of his friends from ministering to him. May God add his blessing to the reading of the sacred scriptures. Many of you, at least on occasion, utilize commentary literature and follow along as we make progress through this unique book, the Acts of the Apostles. Regrettably, there are times, as in all commentary, that attempts are made that go astray. A commentator may be expert in language or in a particular area of theological study, but perhaps not so knowledgeable in other areas such as history and culture and the manner of how historical narrative proceeds. So when some commentators say that Tertullus made a limited effort and that he did not come up to the standard required by the day, they regrettably err considerably, because at the very heart of what Luke is communicating to his audience, the readership, is that Tertullus is a skilled sophisticate, standing at the very highest order of rhetorical skill, and that Ananias, the high priest, who was, in addition to being villainous and unscrupulous, was fabulously wealthy, had hired the most expensive, most skilled, and most coveted attorney that he could purchase. We're going to follow Tertullus and see that his credentials and his performance match. He does a magnificent job. But it is Luke's point to show us that Paul's truthfulness will triumph even over rhetorical skill. Let's look at the 5 days. That has been, in verse 1, the time between Paul leaving Jerusalem under guard and being transferred to Caesarea. There he is kept in the praetorium, we have learned. He is given reasonable privileges as a Roman citizen, and he awaits his accusers. In verse 1, we learn that Ananias, Paul had called him a whited wall. He would not let that effrontery pass. So he and a selection of elders from the council make their way to Caesarea to accuse Paul before Felix. We're told here that the time is approximately 5 days later, and that they bring an attorney. But the word used, attorney, is from the word written out, rhetor, or the word from which we get our word rhetoric. Tertullus is not a research lawyer. Often in law firms, junior partners do the research on the case and formulate the alleged facts of a case, and then they are often given to the lead attorney who is skilled in prosecution and rhetoric. So the actual word here, and it's found in some Bibles' notes, the actual word used for Tertullus is orator. They hired an orator. Now remember, Ananias and the elders are Jews who comprise the leading court of Israel, the Supreme Court of Israel, if you will. But they are not necessarily skillfully versed in interaction with a Roman prefect, procurator, or governor. And so what Ananias has done, before we ever come to the text of verse 1 of chapter 24, is to secure an individual who will be able to skillfully prosecute Paul in terms of a Greco-Roman court rather than in terms of the Jewish Sanhedrin. And Tertullus is the man now who fills the bill. Just a word about him. His name, of course, is a Gentile name, and though some think he may have been a Hellenistic Jew, it is quite possible that he himself is a skilled Roman Gentile, one who would be fluent and fluid in his use of the Greek language. The case would have been conducted in Greek. Though he is a Roman procurator, Greek was the language of most of the courts in the eastern part of the empire. So the fabulous wealthy Ananias hires the skilled sophisticate Tertullus. And what Tertullus does is not a feeble effort, as he has been described in some commentary literature, but a highly skilled effort that, were it not for God's grace and Paul's truthfulness and the providence of God using Paul, surely Paul would have been convicted, and in being convicted, he would have been handed over to the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin. We'll see this as the narrative flows. Let's look at Tertullus and what he does. First, an English reader beginning in verse 2. An English reader believes that there are too much flowery introductory rhetoric. That is to say, to us and our culture, Tertullus begins in a way that is effusively flattering. And this appears, again, to an English reader and to some commentators as being an attempt by Tertullus to ingratiate Felix with his particular course of prosecution because of this praise lavishly heaped upon Felix, who is the Roman governor, who is going to try this particular case. But what misstep that is, because in the ancient world and among the textbook handbooks on rhetoric, an orator or a rhetorician was to, in fact, indulge in some initial flattery as a matter of historical convention. To say it this way, had Tertullus left out any praise of Felix, it would have been an egregious fault according to the Greco-Roman culture. So when an English person reads this, they do so and sometimes smirk and say, oh, he's just a rookie with a lot of high-blown rhetoric. There's no content to this. But what we have to understand is this is a first century Roman court, and Tertullus has been hired as a skilled orator, and he knows precisely what he is doing in going by the textbook, and especially as he makes reference to Felix presiding over a peaceful regime. And his argument is going to be, by way of inference, that the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which was the ultimate ideal of Roman government, that Rome established peace, he is going to use flattery now in a legitimate, conventional manner to point out that what Felix has done in his administration in Judea is to continue the Pax Romana and to preside over a peaceful governorship. And so this is appealing not only by way of following a convention, to not have given some praise to Felix would have been an offense and would have put him immediately behind in his attempt to argue the case. So what he is doing is cultural and conventional. But what he does beyond convention is he skillfully weaves the topic of peace. Now, it is also true there are many cynics about Roman peace. I think many of you have heard the quotation, Rome made a desert and called it peace. That's a well-known quotation that is recorded in Tacitus, who is a Roman historian, records that from a leading social commentator, we would call them, on Roman warfare and subsequent government. Rome made a desert and called it a peace. But since the days of Octavius and Augustus Caesar, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was the ultimate virtue of Rome. And to transgress or incite or activate resistance to that peace, to that Roman firm hand of government, was an ultimate crime. And so what Tertullus is doing here, he is first giving the conventional compliment. It's really not overdone. And his compliment topically has to do with the fact that Felix has presided over a peaceful regime. Since we have through you attained much peace. Now there is perhaps a kernel of truth in this, in that Felix had waged a ruthless campaign with his soldiers against the Sicarii, we've talked about them, and against brigands and thieves. It is true, he tried to repress the criminal element within Judea that was running rampant when he took over from Cumanus, who preceded him as governor. So there is a smidgen of truth to this, but what Tertullus is really doing is saying, your governorship has been one of peace, and this man whom we have brought before you is disturbing the peace, not only here, but throughout the empire. Follow his words. Your providential reforms are being carried out for this nation. In other words, administratively, you are enacting laws that will make for peace. We have attained much peace. And everywhere, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness, we are indebted to you for this peacefulness. But, verse 4, do not let me weary you any further. I beg you to grant us by your kindness a brief hearing. Now, if you have a Roman textbook on rhetoric, one of the characteristics of a successful speech in a court is appropriate brevity. And the two rules are this. Do not include those things which are not germane to your case, but do not leave out those things which support your case. I think that's common sense that many of us would recognize as good advice. But when Tertullus, again as a skilled orator, says this, he is complying with what Felix knows to be a procedure that is characterized by brevity. So that Felix is, if you will, it has sort of a therapeutic effect on Felix. Oh, he's going to be brief in what he has to say. He's going to give me the facts. He's finished his compliments. He's complimented me on enforcing the peace. And now I'm not going to have to listen to a tedious and tiresome harangue. He is going to exercise that rhetorical gift of brevity, even though he is going to include those things which are helpful to make his case. So his mention of brevity is not just a flower of rhetoric, it is an intentional reference to the protocol of a highly skilled orator who is letting his audience know that only what is necessary for the case will he bring before the court. So this is an important statement that he makes in verse 4. Secondly, pest. Now, that word is just worlds away from this historical reference, because for us, a pest is someone who is an annoyance or pesky. We think of someone, that guy's pesky. Individual's pesky or a pest, a nuisance. But the word is literally plague or pestilence, but that's not the most important thing about it. I have to give you, in keeping with what is important to the subject, I have to give you an example of when this particular description was used and why we have been impressed from beginning to end with the skill of Tertullus. Why does he call Paul a plague or a pestilence? For this reason. In AD 41, Claudius was in his early years as emperor. Claudius issued a biting citation to the Jews in Alexandria. Remember, Alexander founded Alexandria. It's a Greek city. And only Greeks had citizenship in Alexandria. Jews comprised 1/5 of the population of Alexandria. 20% of the population of Alexandria was Jewish. But the Jews were not content not having official citizenship. And they raised a mighty protest, and Claudius saw this as an example of what he called the pestilence or the plague of Jewish agitation. Remember, earlier in the book of Acts, he already expelled all the Jews from Rome because of their infighting and because of their what he called their tendency to be a plague of agitation. This particular edict that Claudius issued came into the popular vocabulary as a way to stigmatize the Jewish people. It became a part of the vocabulary so that individuals would comment, groups of Jews are a plague. It was not so much ethnic or racial as it was characteristic of their life in the cities, where often they agitated, as Claudius said, always agitating for more rights. And in so doing, they were a menace to the Pax Romana. Instead of living peacefully with the Gentiles in Alexandria, they were stirring up to gain more rights, and riots resulted, and troops had to be sent in. And in Rome, they had infighting that caused Claudius to actually expel them from the city. But it is this idea and word plague that entered into the larger vocabulary and culture of Greco-Roman society in the first century. And that's why Tertullus uses it. English readers pass over it and say, well, he's a pest, and that word doesn't carry what it carried in first century, in the first century. It carried with it the connotation that had been attached to it ever since Claudius called these peace-disturbing Jews in Alexandria a plague. And so Felix would have known exactly what that word meant when Tertullus skillfully brings that into his vocabulary to describe Paul. In other words, your reign has been one of peace, but he is one of those pests. No, he is one of those who plague the empire by agitation. He's that kind of person. And so he besmirches Paul by the use of this word, which kind of harmlessly comes into many English versions as pest. But in the context of the culture of that day, it was an inflammatory word that signified a Jewish agitator. So, contrary to some of our very good commentators, this is not a feeble effort. This is a man who has studied the case. This is a man who is using all of the conventional technique of ancient rhetoric. This is a man who has learned the vocabulary. This is a man who is able to very subtly and skillfully insert words to bias Felix, who would, as a Roman governor, quickly have picked up that word. And we find it in here in his speech. He goes on and he makes three accusations. These are going to be given somewhat shortly because we have been over them first. First, he says, he's a pest who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. In other words, that first word, plague, insinuates what the rest of the sentence communicates, that Tertullus is causing this man to be a disturber of the peace. He's a plague throughout the world. Now, you've studied Acts, and we can name off, just as a sample, any number of cities where, though Paul was not himself necessarily intending or himself guilty of doing it, Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, the riot at Ephesus, Paul was, I used the word last week, a lightning rod. And when he went somewhere, often there was the disruption of the peace. And so what Tertullus is doing, it says he's one of those, he's like a plague. And it's not only here in Jerusalem, although they're in Caesarea, it's not only here in Judea that this is taking place, but he's done this throughout the world. Wherever he goes, he destroys that which you, Felix, have set out to guard, the Pax Romana. Secondly, he's a leader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now here, the word sect is our word heresy, but it does not mean a foul of orthodox doctrine. In the first century, the word heresy simply meant a philosophy or a school of thought. When Josephus, the Jewish historian, describes the four philosophies of Judaism, Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots, when he describes them, he uses this word. It's come into our word as heresy, but it has a different meaning. It means school of thought. And the four leading schools of thought, according to Josephus, were just that: Essenes, Zealots, Sadducees, and Pharisees. But what Tertullus, again, with much premeditated thought, obviously, he is skillfully doing, is saying, Paul is not a part of the mainstream of Judaism. He is a ringleader of this group called the Nazarenes. He is not at all a part of the Orthodox ancestral Judaism that Paul claimed to be on the steps of the fortress of Antonia in his Aramaic speech. In other words, he is a heterodox Jew who is spreading different information from what is normally taught in the law and the prophets and the Torah. And this man is a leader of a sect. He is not an Orthodox Jew. He is the leader of an aberrant group of those who are doctrinally astray and follow teaching that originated not among the doctors of the law in Jerusalem, but in Nazareth of Galilee. It's his second charge. And his third is that he profaned the temple. Now, one might think, well, that may not ring with Felix, but we need to remember two things. First of all, it was to go beyond the court of the Gentiles. For a Gentile to go beyond the court of the Gentiles in Jerusalem was the death sentence. And the Asian Jews had accused Paul of taking Trophimus within that boundary. So that was the original cause of the furor and the riot from which Lysias rescued Paul weeks earlier. But what many of us may not realize, in the ancient world, to desecrate any temple was a capital offense. This is one of the things that's behind the riot in Ephesus, great as Artemis of the Ephesians. To desecrate a temple or to rob a temple, temples were used as banks in the ancient world. To desecrate a temple, to profane sacred space, or to rob from a temple was a capital offense if you did so at the temple of Apollo or at Delphi or Epidaurus or wherever you may have been. To profane that temple was to bring a capital charge and the death penalty. So when he says profane, desecrate the temple, not only should Felix know as governor of Judea that he is transgressing the boundary that is set in the Jerusalem temple, but a man who would desecrate a temple is worthy of the death sentence. So the description of Tertullus that signifies him as a weak and misguided wannabe orator is precisely an opposite from what we know from the Greek and Roman culture and what Tertullus actually does. So what you and I as readers sense here is that things are not going well for Paul. This man is a force to be dealt with, and he is skillfully conducting his case. Ananias, no doubt, is standing there thinking it's his money well spent. The final thing he does is bold. He challenges the action of Lysias. And his challenge very simply is this. He was profaning the temple. That's our jurisdiction. The council of the Sanhedrin, the Levitical temple police, that is our jurisdiction. Your Roman commander came in and interfered with a case that does not belong to your jurisdiction. This was in the Jewish temple. He was profaning the Jewish temple. We have the death sentence for those who do it. And Lysias, your chief commander in Jerusalem, interfered with our jurisdiction. And that, I think, is a mark of a real go for the jugular type of advocate and orator here, where he not only goes through the conventions and insinuates many things and states many things, but here he even challenges the leading military official in Rome and Jerusalem. And so this is a formidable case that Tertullus has put before Felix, and it obviously was impressive to Felix in the beginning. All we know from this is he listens. The other Jews who are present, they're just called Jews in verse 9, they simply voice their agreement with Tertullus. And then we have a sort of an interesting picture of Felix here, who is taking this in. And he just nods to Paul, sort of perhaps a nod of condescension, perhaps just that he's the governor and that's all that's necessary. We really don't know what to read into it, except that Luke obviously is aware of what takes place. Some say he's an eyewitness. Some say he took these speeches down in shorthand. Those are conjectural. We don't know, but it is possible. Now Paul, and we can work with Paul in somewhat of a condensed way because we've seen his line of thinking previously in his argument at the council. Notice that Paul, while he does not engage in effusive flattery, he does make a very skillful move in verse 10. He tells Felix in his opening remark that he is glad that he is defending himself before Felix because Felix has governed Judea for 5 years, 52 to 57, and therefore Felix is qualified to have knowledge of the way. And we have this confirmed in verse 22, where it says that Felix has a more exact knowledge about the way. In other words, Paul is saying, I'm glad. He even gives his, what we might even say, his how he is poised at this time. He uses the adverb cheerfully. In other words, because you understand things Jewish, and because you are aware of the way, I'm glad I'm defending my case before you because you understand. Remember these three things. We're in Caesarea. 20 years earlier, Cornelius has received the gospel in Caesarea. Secondly, Caesarea has a thriving church. Philip and his 4 unmarried prophetess daughters lived there. And third, that church had housed Paul when Paul came from Asia Minor. So Felix, who lives in Caesarea, certainly would have some sense of the way, and Luke tells us in 2 places in our text that he does in fact have a knowledge of the way. So Paul is saying to him in a very skillful opening, he omits the flowery rhetoric and simply says, I'm so glad I'm making my defense before you because you live here and you know about the way. And lastly, his wife, actually it's his third wife, but his current wife is Drusilla, the daughter of Herod Agrippa, the Jewish king who was killed in chapter 12. She was his youngest daughter, and she is a Jewess. So he's married to a Jew. So Paul is saying, I'm making my case before someone who's knowledgeable about why I've conducted myself the way I am. And this appears from the very beginning to begin to tilt this direction away from the sophisticate Tertullus, who has done magnificently, over to Paul. And he simply says, please take note of the chronology. I've been here only 12 days. Those 12 days, we might say, would be the first day he met with James, remember? The first day he met with the church. The second day he had a conference with James. Then for 7 days, which gives us a total of 9, the 2 plus 7 days of purification would give us 9, and then 3 days in custody with Lysias. So Paul is saying, I've only been here 12 days, and there are witnesses to my conduct, how I have acted in those 12 days. You can verify in these 12 days what I have done. And he goes down the list and he says, you can take note in verse 11. And he says, he refers to the venues of discussion. where there would have been theological discussion: temples, synagogues, and the city. And if this were a Greek city, he probably would have said the agora. But the city, meaning probably the marketplace where people discuss, he says if you go to the venues where there would be disruption and a breaking of the peace and argumentation and disputation, if you go to those venues, which are the temple, the synagogue, or anywhere around the city, in those 12 days, you will find that I have not been in discussion or in causing a riot. And this is at the end of verse 12. Next, there are no evidences that there are no witnesses that this has taken place. This is stated in verse 13. Now Paul does what he has done before, and why I said we could condense some of this material before moving to the conclusion with Felix. But this, verse 14, I admit to you that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers. Now he's going to do what he did in the council. He's going to shift the subject matter from disturbing Pax Romana and being a plague and one who fomented dissension. It's not a matter of wrongdoing in Roman law and breaking the Pax Romana. It's a matter of theological disagreement among Jewish sects or Jewish schools of thought. All I've done is proclaim the resurrection. So this is going to be somewhat of a anticlimactic, we could say here, anticipating our conclusion. Felix is going to see what Lysias saw and what Gallio saw so long ago and what Festus will discover in the next chapter, that this is not a matter of Paul disobeying Roman law. And Luke is saying to his readership, as we saw last week, Christians and their leaders were not fomenting rebellion against Rome or disturbing the Pax Romana. They were proclaiming the resurrection, and as a result, they were attacked by the Jews, and Paul uses in this case the most damaging piece, what we might call lack of evidence, in his entire case. He tells them, in verse 15, he says, in 15 and 16, he talks about the resurrection. And we need not go back through that, but simply to say that the law and the prophets witness to the resurrection, and I am on trial for my defense of the resurrection and for my maintaining the validity and truthfulness of the resurrection. Now, what wins the case for Paul? It wins it, but our conclusion shows that Felix, well, he didn't do the right thing. And there's a lesson in that. But he says, listen, I was in the temple, and then this word. They found me, verse 18, occupied in the temple, having been purified. Remember when he took the vow that he was purified along with the men who took the vow? That James and the elders had counseled him to pay the expenses of the vow, to purify himself, and to present himself to the priest in the temple as a purified worshiper who was paying the expenses of those who took the vow. He says, not only was I in the temple, not only had I brought alms and offerings to my people, the most pious act in Judaic religion is almsgiving and offerings. Paul says, I came to bring alms and offerings. I was purified. In other words, I was in complicity with every technical matter of Jewish law when I was in the temple. And this is, of course, answering the third charge that he desecrated the temple. I brought alms and offerings, and I was purified. I was found in the temple by myself without riot or disturbance. But some Jews from Asia accused me, and then Paul says this, they're not even here to testify. And the case is closed at this point, it seems, in Felix's mind. And this, of course, is found right in verse 18 and 19. He says, they found me purified without any crowd or uproar, but there were some Jews from Asia who ought to have been present before you and to make accusation if they should have anything against me. The prime tenet of Roman law was you had the opportunity to hear your accusers present their case. They're not even here. They've gone back from Pentecost, from the feast. Apparently, they're already back in Asia Minor. They're not even here at the case to testify. There are no witnesses. And the case is at that point, it would seem, in the judgment of those who have studied at great length this passage, it seems that this clinches Paul's maintaining that he has lived in good conscience, that he has not violated any law, whether in temple, synagogue, or city, that he did not profane the temple, and those who made the accusations against him are not even present. He concludes by simply saying, this is my same statement that I made before the council, verse 20, or else let these men themselves tell what misdeed they found when I stood before the council, other than for this one statement which I shouted out while standing among them, for the resurrection of the dead I am on trial before you today. And so Paul has pointed out that Felix is knowledgeable and that to his knowledge, Paul gives the evidence that the charges against him are false, that those who ultimately began the skirmish in the temple aren't even present to make an accusation, that in his standing before the council, it was never a question of him disturbing the Roman peace. It was a question of the resurrection of the dead. And so Paul, by the mercy of God, escapes from an individual who was minimally skilled, certainly formidable, and probably in Ananias' mind, a certain victory for him when he hired him to come from Jerusalem or wherever he came from. He may not have been from Jerusalem. When he came to present in a Roman court by a Roman individual the case against Paul. So I would say this, that in life, the church often has adversaries that have far more resources than we do. But God is with us, and God preserves Paul by a simple, frank, and sincere and truthful explanation of the facts. God negates the extraordinary skill of Tertullus, the machinations of Ananias in the council, and unfortunately, however, Felix, because he does have, verse 22, because he does have a more accurate knowledge of the way, as I've said, from the church at Caesarea Philippi, from Drusilla, from the Christians who were there, he had some knowledge of the way. He simply puts them off. Instead of dismissing the case as not having evidence, he puts them off because Ananias and the council are high Jewish officials, and for him to rule against them puts him in an awkward position vis-a-vis those over whom he rules. And so what he does is stalls. And what happens is he does treat Paul kindly. Verse 23 tells us he put him in a comfortable place. He allowed his friends to come see him and visit him, so he doesn't deal retribution to Paul, but he leaves Paul imprisoned. And the text later says, we'll see next week, he did this to do the Jews a favor. So we have a lengthy, I recognize, but we need to get through it. This is where the case is going to rest, but we're taking a different tack next week. Paul is going to walk into the tribunal court and give personal testimony of Jesus Christ and try to win Felix to belief in the resurrection of the dead, faith towards God, faith in Jesus Christ, and repentance toward God. A very remarkable snapshot incident, a vignette perhaps, of Paul speaking to Felix personally about faith in Jesus Christ. But God protects him from one of the most skilled individuals on the pages of the book of Acts, and Paul is yet protected by God because in a vision God has told him, "You shall witness at Rome." Let's pray. Father, we thank you for our time together. Though our passage is somewhat lengthy, we pray that it may have been helpful for us to understand what occurred and how you protected Paul. We thank you for his abilities as well, and we thank you that you did preserve him from the court of Felix, from being turned over to the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin. We pray that you may protect us in this way, especially from those who have superior resources to us. We pray that you would nevertheless give us your grace and keep us from evil. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.